I'm Chris Griffin, the Executive Director at the Foreign Policy Initiative. Thank you as we move into the second panel discussion of the afternoon, looking at the second of the major obvious crises that we face in the world today, Putin's challenge to the West. To moderate this discussion, it's a real pleasure to welcome Jamie Kirchick, who is a fellow at the Foreign Policy Initiative. He's also a correspondent for the Daily Beast. Previously, he's reported for the New Republic, for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Jamie has traveled the world and written from multiple locations, but has particular expertise looking at Eastern Europe and Russia. So we couldn't have a better moderator for this conversation. Jamie's a great colleague and friend, and I know that you'll enjoy his talents as a moderator. Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you, Chris. And we have a really amazing panel today. I'm going to be very brief in introducing our panelists so we can get right to it. Starting on my left, we have David Kramer, who just stepped down after 4 years as the director-president of Freedom House, and he's now at the McCain Institute. Previous to that, he served in the Bush administration and the State Department, and has particular expertise in Moldova, Ukraine, Europe, Central and Eastern Europe. Miroslava Gongadze is a TV reporter and anchor for Voice of America. She's covered Ukraine extensively in its two democratic revolutions. She's the widow of Georgi Gongadze, who was an investigative reporter who was allegedly murdered by government authorities in 2000. After her husband's death, she formed a foundation in honor of her late husband, which is dedicated to promoting the rights of journalists and free speech. And to my immediate left is Peter Pomerantsev, who is an author and television producer who spent many years in Moscow producing reality TV, and he's written this amazing new book, which I cannot recommend highly enough. Nothing is true and everything is possible. It is the motto of today's Russia. He's also the co-author of a report for the Institute of Modern Russia, The Menace of Unreality, about Kremlin disinformation. Also very worth reading, and we have several copies out front. So the theme of the panel today is Putin's threat to the West, and I think it's very important that we understand the topic as the threat that Putin poses to the West, not just Ukraine, not just his neighbors, but to the values and to the liberal international order that the United States has upheld for the past 70 years. Each of our speakers has particular expertise in certain parts, certain areas of Russia and Ukraine. And I'm going to start with David, and I wanted to ask you, David, now that you're out of Freedom House, you can say what you want.
Now that I have my freedom.
Now that you have your freedom, how much, right, you've been liberated from Freedom House. How much, the past 6 years, Obama administration foreign policy, how much can we attribute what's happened with Russia, the deterioration in the bilateral relationship, the aggression that we've seen, the gross abuses of human rights within Russia, invading its neighbors? How much of that can be attributed, do you think, to specific policies of the Obama administration, missteps that they've made, or how much of it was basically inevitable once Vladimir Putin came back to power in 2010 or 12?
Jamie, thanks, and thanks to FPI for inviting me in to be on this panel with Miroslava, a very dear friend, and Peter. It's great to be here. Let me start by answering this way, which is the Bush administration policy wasn't terribly good on Russia either. I don't think the Obama administration policy has been better. I don't think the Obama team learned from the mistakes we made. In particular, we did not, despite claims that the Bush administration took a finger-wagging, lecturing, patronizing approach toward Russia on human rights, we stopped raising those issues for the most part, and we went silent. I wish we were guilty of the charge that we took a finger-wagging, lecturing approach toward Russia on human rights. We didn't. And we also didn't do much after Russia invaded Georgia, and that was, I think, also a mistake. So the Obama administration came in, wanted to wipe the slate clean, start over. I think that idea wasn't necessarily wrong in concept, but the execution of it was. And I had warned, as others did, that there were some concerns that we had about the reset approach, that the administration would go silent on democracy, human rights issues, continuing essentially the silence from the Bush administration, but a major difference that they would throw the neighbors under the bus. that it would be a Russian-centric approach, and that the other countries in the region, including Ukraine, would be neglected. The third thing I warned about in 2009 was the missile defense decision. And unfortunately, I would say all three of those concerns came to be true. But more fundamentally, I would say the administration lacked real understanding of what was happening in Moscow. And it didn't fully appreciate the nature of the Putin regime, which is a thoroughly corrupt, rotten authoritarian regime where Putin is hell-bent on staying in power no matter what, including if it requires jailing, killing opponents, critics, invading neighbors. And Putin and his Kremlin circle are determined to stay in power in order to protect the ill-gotten gains that they've gotten over their years in power, and it becomes a vicious circle. So the bulk of the problem, I would argue, is in Moscow. The problem here in this city has been a lack of understanding that the problem is in Moscow, in the inability to develop a serious relationship with a regime that goes in such an antithetical direction that we aspire to.
Right. Miroslav, it's been 7 months, I believe, since Russia invaded Ukraine, and I use that word very specifically because so many people in this town and other capitals don't want to use that word, but I think we should be very clear that Russia has invaded Ukraine, and the invasion happened in March. You saw Senator McCain here earlier. He told us that the Ukrainian people have basically lost hope in the United States. I was in Ukraine last month monitoring the election 2 months ago. I got a similar message from him. Would you agree? Do you think that the Ukrainian people are basically in this for themselves at this point?
That's how they probably feel. Unfortunately, the one thing that they remember, in 1994 they signed that Budapest agreement. They always repeating that. We signed that agreement, and United States, Great Britain, and Russia guarantee, take the responsibility to guarantee our sovereignty, territorial integrity. It didn't happen. I'm explaining to them that unfortunately, yes, we signed an agreement, but that was very simple piece of paper. The agreement doesn't have a particular responsibility. What has to be done if something like invasion happened? So they do feel betrayed by Western powers, and they are asking for help. They are fighting this war. I'm impressed how in 2 or 3 months Ukrainian army become a real force, because I think Putin goal is to destroy, weaken or destroy the Ukrainian military and economic capabilities. And they were able to actually fight back. And at this point, Putin controls only 10% of only Donbas area, one area. It's not a big territory. I mean, Crimea.
Plus Crimea.
Yeah, right. Crimea, right. But Donbas and Crimea actually the most pro-Russian regions in Ukraine. There are 8 Russian-speaking regions in Ukraine, but Crimea and Donbas are most pro-Russian, I would say. I think Putin actually failed in understanding that. He thought that he would be much more successful steering up that pro-Russian feelings in those territories, but he mixed up Russian-speaking with Russians. And it's not the same, and that's why I think that what we have, the situation we have right now, that he is trying to, he failed to steer up. There was no uprising, pro-Russian uprising in the east of Ukraine, and now he's using every possible force to take over. But I don't think he would. I don't think we can hope that he would give up. I don't think so.
Peter, we've had the previous 2 speakers talk about real hard power considerations, invasions of countries, and whatnot. Can you tell us about the threat that the Russian disinformation apparatus poses to the West? And I think there's a difference between disinformation and propaganda that you have written about quite perceptively. Could you tell us how that represents a threat to us?
Yeah, I mean, I was, I and my co-author Michael Weiss, we started researching what we thought would be the subjects of Russian propaganda, and realized very quickly that we actually needed a whole new glossary and vocabulary to talk about what the Russians were doing. Really, since the middle of the 2000s, the Russian military and intelligence have been developing a different theory of war, which is sort of total and permanent war, which doesn't necessarily involve kinetic action, and where the focus is on information psychological operations. I mean, we used to have something called PSYOPs here, but it was a small department in a much bigger military apparatus and a much bigger intelligence apparatus. Don't know about the Americans, but the Brits, we kind of got rid of it after the end of the Cold War. In Russia, everything is now PSYOPs. I mean, everything, like military has been moved away and everything is now PSYOPs. And the way they talk about information in this context has nothing to do with public diplomacy, persuasion, messaging, spin, all the stuff that we're obsessed with. They talk about information, using information for subversion, demoralization, essentially as a weapon. It's a whole different way of approaching the concept of what information can do. Now, obviously, their strength is in Russian language and in populations where they watch Russian TV, because there they obviously have full control over the media, or at least partial control over the Russian language media. So somewhere like Latvia and Estonia are in a very complicated situation, because essentially, in the Russian concept of information psychological war, everything is a weapon, not just sort of media, it's also NGOs, the church, everything. So basically society becomes this sort of endless, what military guys call phase one operation, before the actual soldiers come in. A phase one operation is all about sort of shaping opinions and sort of blackmailing and creating the context for a military invasion. But now we have phase one operations all the time in Latvia and Estonia. So Latvia and Estonia are like, oh my God, what do we do? If we start banning their TV channels, then we stop being liberal democracies. Right. So it's a very insidious threat. It's a way of attacking liberal democracies from inside their very fabric, rather than from outside. So yeah, I can go on and on.
Well, is this, and this is for all of you just to jump in, is there something that's actually more pernicious and even more frightening about this conflict that we have with Russia now? If you look at the Cold War, it was very predictable. They were Soviet communists. They had an ideology. It was in a book. You could read it, Marxism, Leninism. We knew who their allies were around the world. It was various communist parties and front groups. Today, it's completely a different story, very hard to decipher. The Kremlin has allies ranging from Hungarian fascists to German ex-communists. And it's an incredibly adaptable ideology, if they even have an ideology. And in many ways, it's less predictable. So would you say that this current crisis that we have now, if you want to call it a new Cold War or whatnot, how is it different from the old? And is it, in fact, more threatening? That's for all of you to offer your...
I think these comparisons of the Cold War are incredibly unhelpful. I think the problem and the danger is, I would just throw away all the stuff about the Cold War. It gets in the way. And I'd even throw away stuff about the Great Game. Look, the danger for me is Russia's pioneering this now, this new form of third generation, non-kinetic, whatever. The question for me is, does this then become the new paradigm? So we mentioned ISIS in the previous session. ISIS is doing something very, very similar with information. They're doing it bottom up. The Russians are doing it top down. What if other malign non-state actors start to do this? What if this is the future, and we're basically about to face a deluge of disinformation, and we have none of the capacities to deal with it? That's what frightens me. Russia's aims, I mean, yes, you're quite right. What's interesting about them is they're very, very different, and they're very, very sort of like adapted to various circumstances. So they want one thing in Serbia, and they do an operation there. That's very operational. But there is, of course, a grand narrative. And we've got to understand that in its own weird way, Russia is at war with only one country, this one. Yeah. They don't care about rolling tanks into Thailand.
Or Estonia, right?
Yeah, well, they don't really care. Maybe a couple of people do, but most people don't care. The whole point is that if they can find a narrative trick, a little informational provocation to, undermine Article 5, to show that the 1991 transition was a joke, that America is a paper tiger, then America's reputation is undermined. So it's very interesting. We are in a space of pure information war. But the consequences could be really quite, bad if, American credibility is undermined the way the Russians want it to be.
Unfortunately, for a long time, and you asked David the first question about what do we have, what is it a result of our that we didn't do anything, seeing what was going on in Russia. I think, yes, we are bearing fruits from our reset policy and the policy of previous Bush administration. Unfortunately, we were closing eyes on everything what Russia did in the last 15, 20 years. The first proxy war happened in Abkhazia Transnistria first, Transnistria, then Abkhazia, and then again Georgia. Now we have Ukraine, but we didn't do anything back then because we thought, okay, something going on in that part of the world. It's just the Soviet Union just broke up. Nobody understood really what's really going on, and Russia back then were already trying to take territory and destabilize the regions around them to control them. So, but what was I talking about the?
We've been closing our eyes to.
Yeah, we are, yes, and we are still, I think we are still in denial a little bit. And the Western society kind of played a part because look how Russia developed. It's all kleptocracy and corrupt activities. They used foreign banks, they used foreign governments, they used European banks to wash their money. And now they become so powerful that it's hard to find a way to fight with them. And I think the decision to actually put sanctions on Russia, it's a very good decision because first we have to destroy them economically and then see what we can do else. But
The price of oil maybe helping. us.
If I could just pick up on what Miroslava said, I think I've argued for sanctions since day one. I supported the Magnitsky legislation that was passed in 2012 over the objections of the Obama administration. But sanctions alone aren't going to do the trick, and this is where I think not helping Ukraine defend itself against Russia's invasion, Russia's aggression, is an enormous mistake. Ukraine is not a member of NATO, so we don't have Article 5 responsibilities with Ukraine. But nevertheless, Ukraine is a critically important country in the heart of Europe that is essential to fulfilling the vision enunciated by George H.W. Bush years ago of a Europe whole, free, and at peace. And if Russia doesn't stop with Ukraine, it's Ukraine today, it'll be Moldova tomorrow, it'll be Estonia, Latvia. And again, not necessarily tanks crossing the border, though that is happening in Ukraine.
You just need 5 guys in the government building.
Exactly, and but also stirring up locals, buying locals if they can. But the other point I would just make is what distinguishes, I would say, and makes Russia a bigger threat to us than China is China tends to be regime neutral, which is to say China is willing to work with other governments around the world, whether they're democracies or authoritarian regimes. They don't particularly care. They don't necessarily view the advance of democracy in other countries, even in Asia, as a threat to China itself. Russia views the progression of democracy, liberalization, efforts to integrate into Europe as a threat to Russia. Putin views it as a threat because if it can happen in Ukraine, it could happen in Russia. That's what spooked him about the events in Maidan starting last November. It's what spooked him in 2003 in Georgia, 2004 in Ukraine. And so what he does is he says the U.S. State Department is responsible for that because he refuses to believe that indigenous populations on their own could demand democracy, rule of law, end of corruption. And having worked in the State Department, and with no disrespect to my colleagues there, they couldn't organize a parade on C Street.
I plan to go back there. Maybe
maybe not. Not after that comment. And State Department does great work. I worked there for 8 years. But the State Department doesn't spawn a foment revolution.
That's the
It's
CIA.
utter nonsense. Right, it's a different agency. But it is part of, it gets at Peter's point, which is we are viewed as being responsible and behind all these movements around the world. We wake up every day in Putin's mind thinking about Russia, when in fact, most of the mistakes we make are we don't think about Russia. Missile defense, having worked in the Bush administration when it was first launched, really had nothing to do with Russia. And then we did try to bring Russia in on missile defense. With the Rice-Gates meetings with their Russian counterparts in the end of 2007, 2008, you had the reset policy, which could not be more accommodating to Russia and trying to extend a hand and restore relations. And Putin just slapped the hand away and views us as a threat, going back years, not just in the past year.
So maybe Mitt Romney might have had a point when he said
Yes.
that Russia was our greatest
did.
global adversary several years ago. I think we're going to open it up to questions because we have such a short amount of time here. So who in the audience would like to ask the lady over there?
Hi, my name is this working? Oh, okay, sorry. Hi, my name is Charisse. I'm a member of the Alexander Hamilton Society of the Mason chapter. I just had a question based on Putin's obsession with security and the fact that he, there's stipulation that he might want to try to create a buffer zone around Russia again. Do you think that if he does try anything like this, that our Baltic allies might secede to him based on the fact, out of the fear that they think we might not come to help based on what's happened historically?
I want to give credit to the president for his trip to Estonia in September, where I think he did give reassurances to the Baltic states. That said, 2 days after the president was there, Russian forces kidnapped a Estonian security force from Estonian territory, which was a huge signal, not just to Estonia, but to us. But I was in Estonia recently, and I'm in touch with people in the Baltics. I think they're nervous, and they should be nervous, but I do think that they feel that Article 5 does mean something. And I think NATO deserves some credit for doing what it's done to beef up the security of neighbors of Russia. But that said, we have to think not in the old school terms of thousands of troops and tanks crossing the border. It's stirring up local populations along the Russian, Estonian, and Russian Latvian border, even with Kaliningrad and Lithuania. That's where I think the problem can become. And I think, Peter, you said Latvia in particular is vulnerable because of the banking influence of Russian money. And Chris Walker is here. He knows Latvia much better than I do. So I think there should be reason for concern, but I don't think for alarm.
I actually think one of the great unreported stories of the past year really has been the maybe not surprising, but very disappointing reactions from the governments in Central and Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
In particular, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary. The defense minister of the Czech Republic recently and the Prime Minister of Slovakia both said that stationing NATO troops on their territory would be akin or remind them of the Warsaw Pact invasion of 1968. This is a remarkable thing to say. Both of these countries are NATO members. Both of those men are old enough to remember what the actual Warsaw Pact invasion was like. You have Hungary, which is a complete separate story. We could have a whole day's panel worth about that country. But these are, who would have? I think that in general, in the American foreign policy community, we figured this part of the world was done. They were liberated from communism. They have liberal democracies now. They're set. They're finished. Let's move on to sexier topics in Asia, in the Middle East. And what I think the Ukraine crisis has exposed is just how real shallow those assumptions were.
But I would like to emphasize the issue of propaganda. And actually, Russian-speaking, we have a lot of Russian-speaking population in Baltic states. And Riga, considered the most pro-Russian town in Baltic states. So the Russian propaganda is very, very successful. And we here have to be very careful, actually, and alarmed to that propaganda. Look at RT, what they are doing. Look at Rappli, what they are doing. Recently, I was in Ukraine, just a little story. I was in Ukraine with Vice President Biden, and we were trying to go with President Poroshenko to put flowers to the fallen on Maidan, and there was a lot of victims of people who died, and they were upset with Poroshenko. He didn't do enough for them, so they were just upset, right? So Poroshenko laid flower, and they started screaming. So Biden decided not to go. It was very kind of simple story happened. There's nothing to do with Biden at all. And the people were there, just the poor people who lost their loved ones, right? So first story coming from Washington, I see, is from Politico. Politico put Russia Today and Rapley story on their website and wrote an article and said, Vice President Biden dodged angry mobs in Ukraine. Where did they get it from? Did they at least research what really happened? Spend 5 minutes checking the information? No, it's easy to take something from Russia Today or Rapley, put it on their website, and we are reading it and repeating the lies. I mean, I've thought maybe 10 or 20 articles, similar articles around in Western media. We have to be very, very careful what we are here putting on and not be...
Peter, this is what you addressed in your report. Could you maybe distill for us, give us the Reader's Digest version? How do we, on the one hand, maintain our traditions of free speech, First Amendment, while, on the other hand, needing to respond to these lies and disinformation and propaganda? I mean, there are many people who say that RT should be shut down, that it's an FSB front, it's not a legitimate news service, and they should be kicked out of the country. And the British government is maybe fining them for breaking the broadcasting standards. I mean, how do we balance these concerns?
Yeah, it's Ofcom, that's the regulators in the British government. But it's a very good question because it is it's a subtle question because let's say the British situation. See, the key idea in Russian information war is something called reflexive control, which was very, very big in the 60s and 70s. And basically, the big difference when we think about information war, to the extent that we think about it, it's usually about making people like us. So we'll go to Afghanistan and play some pop music, and suddenly they'll be dancing and they'll buy some T-shirts or something, and wow, there'll be democracy, which worked really well. The Russian thing is a bit different. So the idea behind reflexive control is that you get inside the other side's information processing system, intellectual system, and then you spin it from inside. So they say that the Americans started this, most famously when the Americans claimed they were sort of building up Star Wars and stuff, and the Russians spent loads of money, and the Americans weren't really doing it, and the Soviet Union was bankrupt. Damn, cunning America. So as usual, it's like the Russians always start with the idea that the Americans do it to us, we have to do it back. So is Russia Today actually a reflexive control kind of operation? Is the point of Russia Today to get the British to ban it in order to give them much more PR?
As victims.
Yeah, as victims. So listen, so there's already, so RT launches, and immediately they have posters everywhere going, if we get taken off air,
go to RT.com.
Yeah, go to RT.com. Nothing's even started yet. So it's almost as they're pushing Ofcom. And they say, come on, ban us. And Ofcom, I think, are very aware of this, and they're doing this bizarre dance. If you look at the way they're trying to regulate them, it's like you have to be more impartial. RT are like, well, but we're an alternative news site. They're like, so where is the alternative to your alternative? You're being very one-sided. And it's bizarre watching them kind of sniff around each other, because I think the British are incredibly aware of what the Russians are up to. So in America, of course, this isn't possible because you have the First Amendment, and hallelujah, and thank God for that. But there is a sort of a dark side to the First Amendment. It's sort of like, the right to talk. To lie, basically.
We're on C-SPAN.
Yeah, exactly. So I didn't. So what does one do? I think it would be nice to look at ideas of how to regulate the system from inside. This is much more about us than it is about Russia. Russia's just exploiting something that exists. So I'd like to see a kind of a Transparency International for disinformation, an internationally recognized rating system which would not rate propaganda, which would just rate disinformation and misinformation. So somebody like an RT or maybe some American channels would get a 1 out of 10, while the BBC would get a 7 out of 10. So immediately we can just start regulating ourselves a little bit. Because again, my fear is what RT is doing now, everyone's going to start doing tomorrow. And this is much more sort of pernicious than sort of like, sort of Fox News doing, being obsessed with birth certificates.
Right.
But it's this, even though there are similarities.
Yes. In the back, right there.
Okay, thanks very much. Jay Hallen, part of the FPI Leadership Network. I'm not a Russia expert, but something I've always thought about is with regards to Ukraine. I mean, it's been a tug of war. If you leave Ukraine as is, it seems it will be a tug of war going into the future. Putin will always have his tentacles in there. Is there anything to the idea of a strategic concession? Concede Crimea and maybe some of the other eastern parts so that the electoral balance is now fully tipped toward the Western parties, so that, it was a smaller Ukraine, a more united Ukraine, one that can be a more confident member of the West. Is there anything to that idea, or would that be, the first pin falling and then the other countries?
Very good question. I'll leave that to David and Miroslava. And
Want to go first?
Go on.
Peter.
Yeah, maybe you can calm down. The short answer is no. It would be appeasement, not concession. It wouldn't be a deal. Putin would view it as weakness, as an opening, and his appetite would only be whetted, not sated. And so Ukraine was a peaceful country before all this. Ukraine was not a divided country. Crimea wasn't looking to break away from Ukraine. Crimea was part of Ukraine since 1954, and Putin wants to revisit all the international agreements and understandings, particularly in the post-Cold War period, which opens up an enormous Pandora's box. We shouldn't facilitate that. We should take the same approach toward Crimea that we did toward the Baltic states after they were absorbed by the Soviet Union, where we never recognized their annexation, and we should maintain that position and keep the sanctions in place until Crimea returns to Ukraine. The first sanctions were imposed in March of this year because of Russia's annexation of Ukraine. And until that's undone, I don't see any reason to lift those sanctions. I don't see any reason to recognize Crimea as part of Ukraine. You can't even pretend, but part of Russia, you can't even pretend that the referendum was serious. No one can organize a referendum in 2 weeks. And given that there were troops on the ground, even if they weren't wearing identifying insignia, people are intimidated by that very kind of environment. And so it was a farce of a referendum. The West was absolutely right not to recognize it. What's also notable is no other country in the former Soviet Union has recognized it. So they're nervous, they're afraid, and if we conceded Crimea, all of those countries would be terrified
Like
as
Kazakhstan,
well.
where there's a large.
Where Putin recently said he didn't think it was a real state, that Nazarbayev is responsible for it.
He said that Bulgaria doesn't have a national sovereignty, cannot make their own decisions. So he would never stop, unfortunately. So
That said,
if
when I was
you-
in Ukraine, I'm sure you can
Yeah.
back me up on this. There are Ukrainians who would agree with you, particularly in the West,
Yes.
who say enough of this Donbass stuff. We don't want our sons dying for these people, and we've never really considered them Ukrainians. That's a minority. I'm not trying to.
Look, I think Miroslava knows much better than I, but I think the reason Poroshenko's party came in second in the parliamentary elections on October 26th is more Ukrainians think Poroshenko has made too many concessions already to Putin. I have some empathy for his position because I think the West isn't leaving him much choice. But I think he has been engaging with Putin too much because Putin isn't interested in a compromise. Putin's goal in Ukraine is destabilization. He wants to make Ukraine ugly and unappealing to the West so that the West loses interest in Ukraine. He wants to do that to all of his neighbors. You would think, what a stupid idea to create instability along your borders. But instability to Putin is much better than having Moldova and Georgia and Ukraine move closer to Europe, democratize, liberalize, because that becomes a threat to Putin.
I mean, I cannot say anything better than David said. So
Oh, I bet you
it's,
could.
he's
Say it in
perfect.
Ukrainian.
He's perfect. Oh, yeah.
Peter, do you have anything, or should I go on to other?
No, this we've got, I think they covered it very well.
The lady right here in the second row. I think we have a microphone for you. Just one moment.
My name is Asta Panonis, and I'm with the Lithuanian American community for many, many years. I'm on their Public Affairs Council now. You're all preaching to the choir as far as I'm concerned. But I do want to ask, we heard Senator McCain's comments this morning where he talked about leadership and standing up to the Russians and not buying into the argument of Brent Scowcroft and others that we've seen in this town that the Russians will merely escalate and we can't win that escalation. Our organization has been part of a coalition lobbying the administration and Congress to make sure that we get military assistance to Ukraine. And the only credible argument they seem to be making out of the National Security Council, no one else in this government does it, only the people at the National Security Council, so do your own mathematics there. are that there isn't enough U.S. public support, and yet the German Marshall Fund's recent study that came out in September shows 43% of Americans believe that there should be military assistance to Ukraine. Now, that's more than a plurality. I realize that, it hasn't gotten to 51%, but what would you say to those NSC staffers right now?
Well, first of all, I'm not even sure that that is the real reason why this administration doesn't want to give arms to Ukraine. I think that the reason why they don't want to give arms to Ukraine is because they don't want to anger Moscow, and they still think that there's perhaps some
View it
sort
as
of
provocative.
They view it as provocative, and they view, unfortunately, these little Baltic countries as nuisances in the way of a larger grand bargain to be made. And I think that we've seen this throughout the administration's foreign policy with Iran, with other adversaries, is that basically let's sweep all these other pesky concerns aside, whether it's human rights, whether it's our traditional allies, so that we can make a grand bargain with our adversaries. That's my read on this administration's analysis.
I think there's a lot of things going on undercover. I had a chance to talk to NSC staffers on a trip to Ukraine recently, and one thing they're trying to do, I don't want to be their advocate, no way. I think Ukraine should get much more than we are getting now, and military support for sure. But there's a lot of, first what they're trying to do to keep the coalition together, the European and United States coalition against Russia. And it's not an easy task. Because Europeans have a lot of financial interest in Russia, and it's very, very difficult to keep them even to hold sanctions, not even anything further. So that's first task that they have, to keep that coalition together, because Russia is interested to divide and conquer, and they want division between Europe and the United States. We cannot let it happen. Second, yes, I think if President Obama is asking 300 billion to fight Ebola and not asking anything to help Ukraine, that means that he doesn't recognize Russia as a serious threat, and that's very, very unfortunate. That what I see. I think Russia is one of the first threats to Europe and basically to the world. They're supporting terrorism everywhere, starting from Syria and in far-right movement in Europe. We have to take it seriously and have to have proactive policy. Unfortunately, at this point, we don't. And it's the American foreign policy machine is it's so difficult to turn around and kind of plan and think. It's kind of changing all the time, but I don't think that there is enough understanding in Washington what's really going on there.
Well, I know I was ragging on our Czech and Slovak and Hungarian friends early, but I think really a lot of this problem comes from the motto of our event, which is the need for American leadership. And if you're a small Central Eastern European country and you feel listless and you see no leadership from Washington, you see no help for you, someone might say, all right, we got to make our deal with the big guy to the east because we can't count on Washington. And I think that, to some extent, is driving a lot of these negative trends that you're seeing in the countries that we had assumed after the Cold War would be some of our strongest allies and supporters of the transatlantic relationship, and haven't been, because I think they've felt left out.
Go ahead. Just one sentence about Russians and propaganda. One of the goals of the propaganda is induce that feeling of betrayal.
Helplessness. Betrayal, right.
Yes.
Just two quick points. One is the push for providing lethal assistance to Ukraine, as you know, is bipartisan. This is not a Republican issue beating up the Democratic White House. You have Senator Menendez, Cardin, Levin.
Murphy? Is Murphy supported?
I don't know about Murphy. But the legislation passed in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on September 17th, 18-0. Nothing passes 18-0 these days. That's a sign of strong bipartisan support for providing the Ukrainians the means to defend themselves. Second point is, I think one of the biggest mistakes, I support the administration's sanctions approach, but I do think the public and repeated rejection of Ukrainian requests for military assistance is an enormous mistake. It telegraphs to Putin what U.S. limitations are. The Washington Post coined a phrase, gratuitous clarity. It's a wonderful phrase. We are far too clear on what we won't do.
It's the opposite of strategic ambiguity.
Exactly. I want Putin to wonder, that guy at 1600 Pennsylvania is a little unpredictable. He's a little uncrazy. I don't know what he might do. And instead, we go out of our way to say what we won't do, and we essentially open the door to Putin and let him walk in. That's a huge mistake, and you're absolutely right. Our European allies, Canadians who have been great on Ukraine, are not going to get out in front of us on this issue. They need the United States to take a leadership role, and we're not doing it.
More questions? This gentleman right here.
Tim Francis, I'm from AFRICOM, but always interested in Europe. And the one country that hasn't come up in conversation yet, and the one that is probably the most firm against Russia, is Poland.
Yeah.
And just was wondering if you had comments on sort of the Polish take on Ukraine and their sort of feeling about dealing with Russia overall.
Well, I think we got a pretty good indication of the Polish take when the former Foreign Minister Sikorski's private conversation was leaked, where he said that his country's alliance with the United States was worthless. It's obviously not something he's going to say publicly, but I think that you talk to a lot of Poles behind the scenes, and they will express similar sentiments. But as for the rest of my colleagues
I
here,
think there are the sentiment is the same as Ukrainian. Happy to Poland that they were able to go ahead so far economically and being effective as a state, that Ukraine has to rely on Poland right now as a leader in European Union for support. And one thing, Tusk is in Europe now. He's leading the council, so we Ukrainians are very, very hopeful that Europe would be much more on the side of Ukraine at this time.
I would just add that Freedom House, and by the way, I was kidding about gaining my freedom after leaving. It's a wonderful organization. Freedom House just recently issued a report on how 10 countries in the EU promote democracy beyond their borders. And Poland came in second after Sweden. I think Poland actually deserves a lot of credit for what it has done. And it's in a difficult position because of geography and because it is sort of the exposed flank for NATO. But I think for the most part, the Poles deserve a lot of credit. I think the Baltic states deserve a lot of credit. I think they've been incredibly brave, given that they have been targets and victims of gas cutoffs, food cutoffs, cyber attacks in 2007 in Estonia. They're at the front line. And I wish more countries in the rest of Europe would follow their lead.
Peter, anything? Do we have time? Do we have time for one more question? One more question. This gentleman right here.
Again, Lieutenant Colonel Jeff Schreiner, I'm a defense fellow at the Stimson Center. I understand the information warfare and the new front that's been opened there. The harsh reality is that you have a country that still has the largest combined strategic and tactical nuclear forces in the world. How do you feel, given the modernization that's going on within the strategic forces in Russia, how do you feel that Putin views his nuclear forces and how they will play out in the world in the mid to long range?
Well, a few years ago, you had General Makarov, who was the former chairman of their armed forces, threaten to use nuclear weapons preemptively if NATO continued to enlarge. The reaction in this city was, oh, we've heard that before, let's just brush it off. Remember in 2008, the night that Barack Obama won the U.S. election, then Russian President Dmitry Medvedev threatened to put Iskander missiles in Kaliningrad, in part because he thought, and this shows how poorly the Kremlin understands the United States, that John McCain was going to win. He wouldn't have done it with Barack Obama if he thought he was going to win. And so the Russians have become rather reckless, one, in talking about use of nuclear weapons, including there's been concern about deployments of some missiles to Crimea. They become incredibly reckless and dangerous with use of military aircraft buzzing NATO allies and EU member states and others, flying along the Mediterranean coast of Portugal, and they turn their transponders off, which greatly increases the risk that there's going to be a terrible accident. where one of these planes is going to crash into a civilian airliner, just like Russian forces and Russian-supported forces shot down the Malaysian airliner, which, by the way, none of us has mentioned during this 45 minutes. It's amazing how quickly people forget that 298 people were murdered by a Russian missile. The Russian military is much better shape than it was in 2008. It struggled against Georgia. It's struggled against Ukraine, but because Ukraine is not Georgia. Ukraine is a much bigger entity to take on. I think it's a mistake to continue as we have in the past to sweep these threats and sweep this talk under the rug and say, that's Russia being Russia. I think it has to be taken much more seriously, particularly when Putin says to Poroshenko or to Barroso, I could be in Kiev or Riga or Tallinn or Vilnius or Warsaw in 2 hours.
So
or
let's
2
divide
days.
Ukraine in half.
Or his defense of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and with it the secret protocols with dividing Europe. The response to the question about the Baltics, that's what would make me nervous, is Putin's talk like that. Again, we tend to just say, it's Putin being Putin. Well, Putin's a liar in denying that Russian forces were in Crimea, and then he admitted he lied. But there are certain things that we should pay serious attention to, and attention of people under him. Makarov is no longer the chair of the general staff, but I took that seriously. It's a pretty. If Dempsey said that about Russia, he'd be fired. And he should be fired. I'm not saying Dempsey should be fired.
That's all I'm saying.
There was the quote.
That's
I
the
could
RT
see it.
headline tomorrow.
Exactly.
Well, on that note, I think we have to go to a coffee break. But thank you all so much. This was excellent. We could have gone on much longer. But thank you.